Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next video on graphing, and this is going to be a quick guide to surviving science. So let's think about why we go through and graph data. Well, if I gave you this giant number set and I asked you to give me an extrapolate and interpolate on this, and I wanted you guys to tell me what do you see from these numbers, it would be really difficult to do that. So what we use is a graph, and we can break down graphs and use them as visuals to extract information and allow us to visualize that information easier. So I can use this information to extrapolate on a variety of different things. I can figure out different effects of temperatures on the climate. I can figure out different effects of populations and how those animals and organisms within those ecological systems affect the abiotic and biotic features. And I can visualize all of that with a graph. So there are 5 main graphs that you guys have to know in science. And the first one that we have and the most common is a line graph. Now the second graph we have is a bar graph. The third one is a scatter plot. We also have circle, or some people call them pie graphs. And then probably the least common is going to be the histogram. The histogram is another type of graph that we see. Now, we represent this data through graphs because it's the best way for us to go through and visualize what that information that we're reading is. And a graph is simply a visual way of displaying the data, and we read it kind of like we read a book. Now, again, we're using our graph types here, the 3 most common: line, bar, and circle. And what we're going to do is interpret or read the graphs. And we can extrapolate and interpolate what type of information those graphs go through and hold. So let's start off with the line graph. So in this case, we see a line graph. And on the y-axis, we have time in weeks. And on the x-axis, we have height of the grasses. And a line graph is allowing us to gather information over time and compare 2 different groups or to a variable that affects these 2 groups in this specific instance. So a line graph is the most common type of graph that you're going to see in science, and it represents an intersection of data comparing among the x and the y axis here. And we can see in this image we have the comparison of an experimental group and a control group where we have nitrogen added to the grass and no nitrogen added to our control group. And we can compare the data amongst both of these experimental groups and the control groups to see which one is having an effect on the height of our grass. Alright, so the next graph that we're going to see are bar graphs. And bar graphs are going to go through and show us information about quantities or categories. So the quantity being measured appears on the vertical axis while the categories appear on the horizontal axis. So what we can tell by this bar graph is this is giving us dietary sources of magnesium. On the x-axis we have magnesium content, and on the y-axis we have the different types of, in this case it's cereal. And we can immediately tell, well, Fruit Loops and Corn Flakes are giving us the most amount of magnesium, while Cheerios, the generic brand, and Lucky Charms are not giving us as much. And it's allowing us to go through and compare different categories and quantities among those categories. Now next we move on to the circle graph, or the pie chart. So a circle graph represents data in a useful way describing parts as a percent. So what we can do is break down different data points into percentages. So I can know that 25% of this unified whole has this specific set here, 25% here, 11%, 23, and 16. And what it allows us to do is look at different groups in percentages and then compare them amongst a whole and see that entire whole and visualize it in this particular circle. So circle graphs are going to be really useful for when we go through and look at percentages among data points. The next graph that we're going to see is what we call a scatter plot. And a scatter plot can sometimes be confused with a line graph. And a scatter plot is going to go through and give you a correlation of variables. So it's a graph in which the values of 2 variables are plotted along 2 axes, and then the pattern of the resulting points is going to allow us to go through and correlate whatever that data point is trying to tell us. So if we're looking at this specific scatter plot, well, this is going to give us the ice cream sales that we see based and comparing it to the temperature. So right now what we see are ice cream sales. So ice cream sales. And what we can see is as the temperature increases, this is in Celsius from 10 to 26 degrees, what we can see is the sales of ice cream is also increases. And what we can do is draw what's called a line of best fit. And that's a line that goes through the center of the data points. And based on that, we can kind of make a generic or extrapolate upon what is going through and happening amongst these data points. Now, instinctually, I can use this line to understand that as the temperature increases, so do my sales. So if I'm a salesperson trying to sell ice cream, I know that on a hotter day, I'm going to make more money than I am on a colder day. So let's say I was going through and looking at this scatter plot here, and I was given a table of data points. Now remember, I can't really tell with these data points right now how my sales are going through and being affected. So what I'm going to go through and do is graph. On the y-axis I have sales, and on the x-axis I have temperature. Now we have a scatter plot here, and this scatter plot immediately goes through and tells me, well, as temperature increases, so do my sales. I have a line of best fit, and I can see that the data points definitely show a trend that as the temperature increases, the sales of my ice cream also go through an increase. And based on this graph, I can instantaneously and immediately tell, based on my line of best fit, what the correlation of the data is and what this graph and what this data set means. Now, the last type of graph that we're going to look at is going to be a histogram. And a histogram is a diagram consisting of rectangles, just like a bar graph, whose area is proportional to the frequency of a variable and whose width is equal to the class interval. So a histogram is going to compare, in some cases, a couple variables and try to represent that in a way that a bar graph would. And what we can gather from this is frequency of data points, and we can extrapolate and use curves to understand that as the frequency increases or decreases, what is the effect on the variables that we have that are interlaid within our data points? So there's two ways of going through and interpreting graphs. The first way is interpolation, and the second way is extrapolation. Now, interpolation is where continuous data occur when all the points on the line graph are connected. And this is generally when we're looking at a line graph. And this continuous data allows you to read any point that falls between the recorded points. So what we call this is interpolation. And what we can do is analyze data points by connecting the lines together. And those lines are going to allow us to see is we have increases and decreases in the population over time based on these data points. And connecting these lines allows us to go through and interpolate that data and understand what that graph is trying to tell us. Now, extrapolation is a little bit different. This is going to give us more of a prediction. It's an extension of the data that allows you to estimate variables. So what you can do is extend the lines beyond where they occur. So in this case, we are extrapolating that maybe in 2017, we're going to see a decrease here, and we're trying to make a prediction about the future. So interpolation is more of how do we read the graph in the present, and how can we use tools to go through and understand that graph, whereas extrapolation is trying to estimate and predict potential occurrences in the future. So let's say we were going through an in-depth reading a scatter plot here and trying to make correlations from this. Now what we see here is positive correlation, what we see here is negative correlation, and what we see here is no correlation. So if we were going back to our ice cream sales, we were assuming that temperature here was on the x-axis and ice cream sales was on the y-axis. Well, we would draw our line of best fit through all the data points here, and we would see that as the temperature increases, well, our ice cream sales increase. So in this case, we have positive correlation because it's increasing as we compare our x-axis to our y-axis. So if we look at this scatter plot here, well, we're going to draw our line of best fit the same way we drew it with the positive correlation. So again, we start left to right, so left-hand side of the graph to right-hand side of the graph. We'll draw our line of best fit through the data points here. And what we see is, well, as our x-axis goes through, if let's say this is time, and let's say this was sales of something, what we're seeing is the correlation is negative, or that whatever on the y-axis is going to decrease as we increase with time, or maybe it's temperature, it's some sort of variable here. So if we're pointing this way from left to right, we have positive correlation. If we were pointing down here this way, we have negative correlation. Now, if we look at this graph here, what we can see is no correlation. And this is no correlation because I can't really draw a line of best fit through these data points. There is no trend. So what this means is what we went through and completed in our experiment, well, the data does not give us a definite trend. So we would do one of two things. We would either conclude that there is no correlation between whatever variable we're looking at here, between our x and y axis, or we would go through and redo the experiment to make sure there was an experimental error. A lot of the times when you get no correlation, it could be experimental error, which would tell you that, okay, maybe I need to go through and tweak or redo my experiment. Okay, so what's wrong with this graph? Well, the first thing I'm looking at here is it does have a title, but we might want to go through and capitalize that. It's not a big deal, but maybe we want to capitalize plant and lab here. The second thing that I'm seeing, the big thing here that I'm seeing is our x-axis here. So our x-axis is not labeled. And over here, our y-axis is not labeled. Now that's a problem because I don't really know what data points I'm going through and comparing here. So this x-axis here could be telling me, okay, well, I have 5 milliliters maybe of water, 7 milliliters of water. Maybe this is the water that we're giving the plant. Maybe this is grams of nitrogen that we're giving the plant. But the first thing is I have no label, and that's a big problem. And this gets into my second point that I don't even know what units we're going through and measuring this in. So I don't know if we're giving this one nitrogen or water, but I don't know if we're giving it milliliters, liters, grams, kilograms of whatever substance to make this plant grow. The other thing here is on my x-axis, it's again not labeled, but the other big thing is I only have one data point, 12.5. I don't know how tall, and I'm assuming that this graph is going through and telling me the height of the plants as they grow, and you give them whatever substance to help them grow taller. But I only have one number here, and that's a huge problem. Now, I have a picture of a plant here, so again, I'm assuming that this is going through and correlating data points here. Now, the other thing is if I have a line of best fit here, I shouldn't have it if this is a line graph. So I can see that these data points are connected as if they are a line graph, but the thing that I don't understand here is this a scatter plot or is it a line graph? We connected the data points here, so this looks like a line graph here, and if it was, then I wouldn't draw a line of best fit. Now, if these data points were not connected, then this would be a scatter plot, and I would definitely want to go through and draw a line of best fit. But in this case, it looks like a line graph, so I should not have, in this case, a line of best fit. So the most important thing that we try to think about here is we want to include a title, so that way we know what we're going through and looking at. And the other thing we want to have is labeled axes with units and then numbers that go through and give us a representation of what data we're looking at.